Okay, welcome everyone. So, my name's Eric Sanders, and this program is called Voting Methods: Fundamental Change to Create a Responsive Government. And just a little bit about who I am. I am on the board of the Center for Election Science. This is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that researches voting systems and helps people make better, more informed collective decisions. Now, what does that all mean? We will get to that in a moment. I just want to give you a quick rundown of who our guests are. We have literally three of the world's foremost experts in voting systems. So whether you're watching this online or whether you're here in the room, you can't get any more advanced and sophisticated than these guys. We've got Aaron Hamlin, who's an attorney and the executive director for the Center for Election Science, based out of Washington, D.C., expert on voting systems. Dr. Stephen Brams, a political science professor at NYU, just downtown, and a legend in the field. He is the co-father of approval voting, which he's going to be speaking about today, which was a game changer in the late 70s and early 80s in terms of how we thought about voting and democracy. He's going to speak all about that. And Dr. Jack Nagel, we are so honored to have. He is a professor emeritus of political science at University of Pennsylvania and a prolific author on politics and voting systems. So thank you so much for being here. We couldn't have a better panel. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the structure for today. This is what I'm attempting to do right now, which is to set this all up for you and give you an introduction so it's coherent. We're going to have three 15-minute talks from each of our three expert panelists. I'm going to facilitate a brief but hopefully informative conversation between the panelists that hopefully ties together some of the disparate elements that they've touched upon. And then we're going to open it up to questions from you. And I hope you have penetrating questions. If you don't, something's wrong. You weren't listening, because this is a deep topic. To set this all up for you, to give you a sense of why we're here, what we're doing today, I want to touch on a concept that I think sort of clarifies what we're talking about. And I view problems in sort of two broad categories. There are symptomatic problems and there are systematic problems, right? And so much of our political discourse is focused on symptomatic problems, right? I'm so sick of the money influence and the corruption and the lobbying. I'm so tired of the two-party system. I don't feel like I'm represented. I don't trust the government anymore, right? And then you read polls and you read the news. 13% approval rating for Congress. A poll from last week from Rasmussen. 8% of people polled think that Congress members are reelected because they do a good job of representing their constituents. 8%. 70% of people polled last week said that most members of Congress get reelected, quote, because election rules are rigged to benefit members of Congress. 22% of voters in this poll from last week think the representative is the best person for the job. 42% of Americans, a record number, currently identify as independents, do not have or feel a party affiliation. And again, from last week from CBS News, a record 45% of people polled say they now agree with the statement, it makes no real difference which party controls Congress, things go on just as they did before. This is a crisis of legitimacy that we face in our country right now. People have lost their faith in both representative democracy and the concept of democracy. But let's talk about systemic problems. Let's not get caught up in the symptoms. Let's be like a good doctor and focus on the cause. Why do we not believe in democracy anymore? Why do we not believe our government represents us? So we have to pull back for a second and think deeply about this. What is democracy? What is the goal of a representative democracy? What is representation? What is the goal here? The Greek word democracy means people rule, right? What does that mean? What does that mean? We have these phrases that we like to parrot in the United States. The will of the people, right? The Constitution literally starts with three famous words. We the people. Who? We? Who? How? Right? Who is we? How do we determine and quantify what we, the people, want. That's what we're talking about today. What the word we in the context of democracy actually means and how we can take advantage of and clarify this definition. So to kind of tie this together, one of the things I think we can all agree upon when we talk about this very nebulous concept of what is democracy, what is the point of a representative democracy, one thing I think everyone in this room and everyone watching would agree upon is that a fundamental component of democracy is giving people the ability to register their opinions or preferences to some extent, what we call voting. Voting seems to be a fundamental aspect of democracy in some manner. I think we could agree on that. I hope we can. But let's look at that word. What does voting mean? Right? Now, I want to clarify something, because you're going to probably hear a couple terms here. Hopefully you've heard them before. If not, I'll give you a quick primer. We talk about kind of two very broad parts of what voting entails. The first part is who gets to vote, right? Voting rights. You hear a lot of conversation about this. Should people need an ID to vote? All this sort of stuff. We're not really going to talk about that too much today. That's a very essential conversation. Many people focus on that. But the second part, and just as essential to any understanding of voting, is how we vote. So who votes and how we vote. And that's what we're really going to focus on today. How does our voting method, which is the manner by which we vote and register our opinions or our preferences, how does that actually capture what we want, what we believe? Does it produce an outcome that represents us, or that we feel represents us? So there's two key terms I want to introduce. The first one is voting method. Voting method and voting system are often used as synonyms. I'm not going to use them as synonyms, but if our other speakers do, please understand that they're often conflated. I consider the voting method the actual sort of mechanics of the voting, what the ballot says, how the votes are counted, what kind of options you have on the ballot in terms of, can you pick only one candidate? Can you rate the candidates? Can you pick more than one candidate? That's the voting method. A larger consideration is the voting system in its entirety. The voting system is the entire process. That includes who gets to vote. That includes, registration and all of the other stuff that we're not really going to talk about. So think of voting method as the sort of mechanical piece, the fundamental mechanics within the voting system as a whole. Does that make sense? Beautiful. So today our program is going to consist of Aaron Hamlin, who's going to speak first and identify the systematic problem that we face in our country, which he is going to speak about in depth, and this is our single selection voting method, what is often called plurality voting, where voters are forced by law to pick one candidate on the ballot. If they pick more than one, their vote is thrown away. It's called an overvote. It is illegal. Your vote will not be counted if you pick more than one candidate. Okay? That's what Aaron's going to talk about. Dr. Stephen Brams is going to, thankfully, offer us a systematic solution to this problem. The systematic solution that Dr. Brams pioneered is called approval voting. You could think of this as multi-selection voting, where voters are simply allowed to select more than one candidate on the ballot. That doesn't sound so radical. It also doesn't sound like it should be such a big deal. But Dr. Brams is going to help us understand why that is a fundamental change that will radically transform democracy across the world. And Dr. Jack Nagel is going to tackle a third structural or systematic solution, sort of zooming out further and focusing on a restructuring of our government as a whole and how we actually elect legislators in the context of what is often called proportional representation. If you have traveled abroad, many, if not most other countries that have anything approaching democratic bodies use a form of this. I believe only the US and Canada don't, is that right?
There's quite a few.
There are a few that don't, but most do, right?
More numbers.
More, many other countries use this different system, this different form of government called proportional representation. I will wrap this up and then we'll get started. My goals for you today, and I can see you looking at me attentively, I'm glad, is I'd love you to leave here with a newfound or a deeper understanding of the central role that voting methods and voting systems play in our democratic problems and discourse. It's a criminally unfocused on topic that we're hoping to change. And there's one quote I will leave you with. It's famous from the context of computer science. You may have heard it: garbage in, garbage out. If you put garbage into a system, no matter how complex or sophisticated that system is, you will get garbage out the other side. We are currently putting garbage in, and we are expecting results that represent us and that make us feel like we're part of this we. So let's figure out what the problem is, and then let's figure out how to solve it. So with no further ado, Aaron Hamlin is a licensed attorney. He's the executive director of the Center for Election Science, the organization that I'm on the board of and honored to serve with him. He studies voting systems, all different types of voting systems around the world in order to help people make better collective decisions. He's published numerous articles and given talks across the country on voting methods, particularly on approval voting. In addition to being an attorney, he actually has 2 master's degrees in public health and education. This is a smart man. Aaron Hamlin.
So today I'm going to talk to you about plurality voting, our select one voting method, a very restrictive voting method in as far as how much you're allowed to express. So we're going to take that method and basically throw it under the bus. So that's going to be my job today. And it's well deserved because plurality fails on a couple levels which are really extreme. One is it doesn't do its job in the first place. A good voting method is to select a good winner. Well, plurality doesn't even accomplish that. So secondly, plurality creates a huge barrier to entry. That is, it doesn't give new candidates, new political parties, independents, a very accurate reflection of support. It gives them a very low amount of support, and so it creates a huge barrier to entry for new parties and new ideas. And because of these 2 main failures, we need to be considering alternative voting methods and alternative ways to go about this. And it's not that hard because really this is the bottom of the barrel as far as voting methods goes. We can do pretty much anything and make an improvement on this. So first off, how does plurality voting just get it all wrong by selecting poor winners? So to talk about that, I want to tell you a story about an election in Louisiana in 1991. And this is a rather crazy election. This was a 3-way race. You had one candidate, Buddy Roemer, who is mostly considered to be a moderate. He's the incumbent governor in this situation. He had policies looking at helping educators get higher pay. He had done work on environmental reform. And so he was mostly considered to be a moderate candidate. His two competitors, however, had a little bit more lively character. One of those was Edwin Edwards. Edwin Edwards had actually served twice before as governor, but he had a wild time while he was there. He was surrounded in corruption scandals, embezzlement, and in fact, one foreign business person had testified against him in court, confessing that he had given Edwin $100,000 for preferential business treatment. Now, Edwin, he was a weird character, and so in response to this, he had sort of a strange remark. And so when confronted with this, he said, "Well, it was illegal for this guy to give me all this money. It wasn't illegal for me to take the money." So Edwin has this cloud of corruption, this cloud sort of surrounding him. So largely considered to be a crook in this race, and I'm going to refer to him as just that. And the other competitor in this race, also a lively character, was a man named David Duke. David Duke had a long history of white supremacy. So he was a grand wizard for the Ku Klux Klan, and he had left there, but even there he didn't leave on good terms. He was confronted by colleagues within the Klan of trying to seduce their wives. He had done fundraising for them, which was pretty nice, but he would take the money and use it to remodel his home, which he said he had meetings there, so it made sense. So you have a crook, a wizard, and just a normal, moderate guy in this race. Now, before I spoil it for you and tell you how this turned out, let me tell you a little bit about plurality and how it operates in these types of situations with vote splitting. Now, when we think about vote splitting, we think of support being divided among candidates. So you can only choose one candidate, and so if there are multiple people that represent what you're thinking as far as your ideology, well, you can't support all of them, so you've got some division that occurs there. And typically when we think about that, we think of this division occurring from the sides. So you've got some Democrat and maybe Nader's running this year from the Green Party, or maybe Jill Stein, and you've got some splitting going on over in that sector. Or maybe you've got a Republican and a Libertarian, maybe Gary Johnson is running, and you have some splitting on the other end. So typically we think of this happening from the sides, and we think of a spoiler coming. But that's just one way that vote splitting can occur. Vote splitting can occur in other ways. It can also happen from the middle. And when it happens from the middle, it happens in a way that's a bit more extreme. So when it happens on the sides, you just got one end of vote splitting occurring. But when you have a moderate candidate, you've got vote splitting coming in from both sides. So if you got someone in the middle, well, you've got someone from the right taking away votes, and you got someone from the left taking away votes, and it just squeezes that middle person out. And unfortunately for Buddy Roemer, our moderate candidate, that's exactly what happened to him. He came in third in this three-way race behind our crook and our grand wizard. In this case, there was a runoff, and often we think about runoffs as a way to solve the issues of plurality voting. But it doesn't help in this situation. The damage is already done. So the runoff was between our crook and our wizard. And our moderate candidate isn't even in the runoff. So it doesn't even have the opportunity to fix the situation. Plurality has already done its harm. Now, the major parties recognize that there's this issue with plurality, our select one method, when we have more than two people on the ballot. So here we saw this disaster when 3 people were on the ballot. But they recognize that when more than 2 people are on the ballot, we have this vote splitting issue. And fortunately, they are people of solutions, and they came up with a solution for this one. Don't have more than 2 people on the ballot. So what they did as a response is they made highly restricted ballot access laws. Now, and here I'm going to talk for a moment about these restricted ballot access laws, but I don't want you to think that fixing ballot access laws will give you the solution. When you get on the ballot, plurality is still not going to give you the support that you need, and as a consequence, being on the ballot is not going to be your saving grace. It is not the time to celebrate. You just got on the ballot, and that doesn't give you anything else. So the 2 parties, as far as how they create these restricted ballot access laws, they use signature requirements. So for instance, in Arkansas, the signature requirement, for this year, if you wanted to run as governor in Arkansas, you would need 10,000 signatures. And they're very specific about these. The name has to be in exactly the right way. Oftentimes you have to say specific things. The window that you have to get these signatures is often small. But 10,000 is a lot of signatures, especially for, say, like Arkansas, with not a huge population. So with Arkansas, if you were really good at signature gathering, and say you showed up, you had this great personality, 10,000 people line up right in front of you. This line just instantly appears. And you're really good at doing this, so you get these signatures at a rate of 1 a minute. Well, at that rate, you would be there for an entire week if you didn't take any breaks. No sleep, no bathroom breaks. You're there the whole time. I hope you have a chair because you're going to be there for a while. So that's Arkansas, but this is the case all over the country. Arkansas is maybe sort of a normal example of this. Georgia, for example, if you want to be on the ballot in Georgia, that's 58,048 signatures that you're going to need. If you're doing this at that same rate of one signature a minute, you're going to be out there for 40 days and 40 nights. That's not just a draconian ballot access law, that's a biblical one. I mean, that is serious restriction. In Oklahoma, the ballot access requirement is 79,153 signatures. If you do that same ridiculous pace, you're out there for 2 months. So this is what they do to restrict the ballot access, to make sure that they don't have more than 2 candidates on the ballot. But people are persistent in their views. They're very passionate about having their ideas represented. Sometimes they get on the ballot despite these barriers. But the thing is with plurality voting, when you're forced to select only one, as a voter, you look at the ballot and you see the major parties on there, and perhaps you even bother to see other candidates. But when you're voting, you want to have a say in who wins this. I mean, you care about the outcome of this race. And so you're looking among the front runners here, and you have a preference of one of the two. And if you want to be able to have and say who wins, you vote for one of those two. If you vote for a third party or an independent, well, you're not having a say in the outcome, and you're not having a say in the policy that's going to come about here. But it's even really worse than that, because I think a lot of people, they don't even go through that calculation of throwing away their vote. They don't even really, it's so ingrained in us that these people are going to lose if they're not a Democrat or a Republican. These candidates may as well be on the ballot in invisible ink. I mean, they're just not getting any kind of representation at all. And what plurality does is when we have this narration going in our head, recognizing that we can't vote for these people, what happens is they get an artificially low amount of support. It's not that these people have bad ideas. The 2 major parties don't have a monopoly on good ideas. There are plenty of other good ideas out there. But the issue is they get an artificially low amount of support because the measurement tool that we use to measure the amount of support they have is plurality voting, and it gives an artificially low support. And so when we do polling, which polling is done using plurality voting, you get this call during dinner time, and they ask you, hey, who are you going to vote for? Who's the one person that you're going to vote for on election day? They're using the same voting method, the same measurement tool here, and so we get this artificially low amount of support. And those polls, they come back and the media sees these, and they say, well, I mean, if this person had good ideas, well, they would be polling better. Their poll is not very good, so they must not have good ideas. They're not worth the time on the evening news. And the same thing with debate commissions. Debate commissions, they have to use some specific criteria in order to decide who gets on the debate panel. And often the specific criterion that they're using in this situation is polling, the same plurality polls that are being done during your dinner time. And so they look at that and they say, well, this person's not polling very well. Well, they're not going to be on the debate panel. And so we have these artificially low amount of support here. And so as a consequence, when people have new ideas, and they're coming from new parties, they're automatically marginalized because they're dismissed as not having that amount of support, just because we're using a very poor measurement tool to measure that support. But again, there's plenty of room in the political spectrum here. Some 42% of us identify not with either a Democrat or a Republican. So it's not that the political arena has no room in it. It's just that plurality voting has locked those doors. Now, so plurality voting, it gives us this artificially low amount of support, and it doesn't give us new ideas. So we have to start to ask ourselves, well, what's the solution here? And the solution is to use a different voting method, a different measurement tool that allows us to figure out how much support people have. So we have plurality voting. It's failing on, it doesn't give you the right outcome. It doesn't give you a good winner. So it doesn't even get its basic job right. And then secondly, it doesn't give an accurate reflection of support for all the candidates. So you don't know who has good ideas and who doesn't because your measurement tool is such a poor one. So we recognize that plurality voting, or select one method, is so poor. And so we have to do something about this. So I want you to think about that. Do you want to keep using the same voting method. Like if you want to keep on going on with things as they are, well, you're going to get the same thing. You're going to elect a crook for your governor, whom by the way, Edwin Edwards, he served 9 years in federal prison for the corruption that he committed after getting elected in that 1991 election on 17 felony counts. So these are the people that you're going to get elected. Maybe you'll get a grand wizard, or maybe you'll get someone just like our Congress, maybe a normal congressperson. Our same Congress that this past month got a 9% approval rating, which, by the way, is looking up because the month before it was 6. So the method we have is an absolute failure. There are very easy ways to address this. Pretty much anything we do is a step in the right direction. So as you listen to Dr. Nagel and Dr. Brams, please pay careful attention to what they say. They have excellent ideas to take us away from this hideous, hideous voting method. And so I hope at the end of this, you ask yourself whether it's time to pull the plug on plurality voting, and I hope you say yes.
Woo! All right. Thank you, Aaron. So, you know what the problem is? I think Aaron set it up beautifully. Yeah. Systemic failure. Cancer in the political arena. The patient is dying. The patient may be dead already. But there is hope. We are not going to leave you in this void. We will build up, hopefully, some solutions. Systematic solutions. And to introduce us to one very, very simple but brilliant solution is Dr. Stephen Brams. He is a legendary, and I mean truly legendary, game theorist and political science professor at NYU. He is the modern pioneer and co-inventor, many say, of approval voting, which is what he's going to speak about, which is the solution to everything that Aaron just laid out for us. He wrote the first book on approval voting with his colleague Peter Fishburne. He has his PhD from Northwestern University and his Bachelor's of Science from MIT. It is my great honor to introduce a true legend, as I said, Dr. Stephen Brams.
Thank you, Eric. Welcome everybody to this session. So my charge is to talk about approval voting. So let me begin by defining approval voting. Approval voting is a voting system in which you can vote for as many candidates as you like. You can approve of as many as you like. The candidate with the most votes wins. So it's similar to plurality voting, but the difference is that you're not restricted to voting for only one person. It doesn't matter in a two-candidate race because you presumably would vote for your preferred candidate, only your preferred candidate. But if there are 3 or more candidates in the kinds of situations that Aaron discussed, things become more complicated. So if there were 5 candidates, for example, in the race, you would not be restricted to voting for one. You could vote for 2 or 3 or 4, or even all 5 if you wanted to support the system, but that wouldn't differentiate among the candidates. So presumably, if you have a clear favorite, you might vote for only one. But if 2 or more are acceptable, you approve of them, you could vote for these additional candidates. If you despise one candidate, you could vote for everybody else, the other 4. So it gives you much more flexibility in expressing yourself. Under approval voting, there's no ranking. You either approve or don't approve of a candidate or candidates. I'll make a brief comparison to ranking systems later, and I'm going to be focusing on single winner systems. Jack Nagel will be talking about systems in which you might want to elect the legislature with different points of view, and that's not what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about elections for, say, a mayor, governor, the president, in which you elect only one winner. So you want a candidate who's most representative of the entire electorate. So I made the argument that approval voting allows you more flexible options than does plurality voting. I claim that it also elects the strongest candidate overall, not the strongest minority candidate. So Aaron talked about a situation in Louisiana where ultimately the strongest minority candidate was elected. It could be a candidate on the right, it could be a candidate on the left. Often the candidate in the middle, as this example showed, can be squeezed out. But if you're a voter and you actually prefer the candidate on the right or the candidate on the left, you're permitted to do so. But if you're a candidate on the right, for example, if you support a candidate on the right, you might be worried that the candidate on the left might win. So to protect yourself, you might also vote for the candidate in the middle. He or she is acceptable. And that means that voters will tend to support candidates who are in the middle to prevent the candidate on the other side of the spectrum from winning. And that means the candidate in the middle generally will benefit under approval voting. And the candidate in the middle, the moderate, Buddy Roemer in Louisiana, would presumably have done so if there had been approval voting. I think a better example, which might be more familiar to you, this is a very good example, but a more familiar example is the 2000 presidential election in the United States. And of course, you'll remember that there were two major candidates, Al Gore and George Bush, the son. But there was a significant third-party candidate, Ralph Nader. And many at the forum presumably would support Ralph Nader. But you know Ralph Nader had no chance of winning. So do you stick with Ralph Nader, or do you switch to presumably Al Gore for most people on the left, because that would help prevent George Bush from winning? But you weren't permitted to do so. And I'll just mention some statistics from that election. You remember that George Bush won Florida by 537 votes, with a little help from the Supreme Court as well. Ralph Nader got 97,000 votes in Florida. So if the voters had been able, the Nader voters in particular, had been able to vote for a second candidate, polls show that probably about 2/3 would have voted for Gore. Some would not have voted. And in that particular case, Gore, instead of losing by a few hundred votes, would have won by tens of thousands of votes with the support of many of these Nader voters. So that's a good example, it seems to me, that's familiar to many of you, in which the election system screwed up. And in my opinion, elected the wrong candidate in Florida, but if Gore had won Florida, he would have won the national election, and we would have had a different president in 2000. So there are many examples like this, even at the presidential election level, in which the wrong candidate won. Wrong in the sense that he or she is not most representative of the electorate as a whole. We actually have a name in voting theory for a candidate who can beat every other candidate in pairwise comparisons. We call this candidate a Condorcet winner, after the Marquis de Condorcet of late 18th century France. And it's pretty clear that Gore in 2000 was a Condorcet winner. He certainly could have beaten Nader in a one-to-one contest, and he almost surely would have beaten Bush, because he won by 500,000 popular votes, lost in the Electoral College, of course. So approval voting, I claim, tends to elect the strongest candidate overall. Not the strongest minority candidate, which some of these examples illustrate, probably won. At the same time, it gives minority candidates their proper due, because in the case of the 2000 election, if you were a Nader supporter, you didn't have to take away your vote for Nader to give it to Gore. You can have your cake and eat it too. You can vote for both Nader and Gore. And that means that Nader, instead of getting about 3% of the popular vote overall, probably from polls would have gotten 10 to 12% approval. So he was a significant third-party candidate, but he suffered what we call in political science a wasted vote phenomenon. Why vote for a candidate who cannot win? But enough did so as to prevent the Condorcet winner, Gore, in 2000 from winning. So I think that's a good thing. I think not only should an election system elect the most approved candidate, the Condorcet winner, if there is one, but it also should register residual support for other candidates like Nader in 2000. I also claim that approval voting probably would reduce negative campaigning. As you all know, it's a serious issue today. And the reason that I make this argument is that, let's say in a 3-candidate race, if you trash your opponents, then you're probably not going to get approval from them or their supporters. But if you need their support to win, then you're going to broaden your appeal and reach out to them, which means you cannot win by just trashing the opposition and conducting an entirely negative campaign. So I think the implementation of approval voting would create much more civilized campaigns, emphasizing the positive, since a purely negative campaign could backfire. I think it also would increase voter turnout, because one of the problems that people have is because they can vote for only one candidate, they cannot express themselves well. So if there's a candidate you despise, then, as I said earlier, you can vote for everybody else. Whereas if we had plurality voting, you'd have to make an arbitrary choice of several acceptable candidates, and now they divide the vote, and maybe the candidate you despise can win. But now you can vote for everybody else if you despise one candidate and support all of them. So that increases the chances that somebody acceptable will actually win. Now, because you can express yourself better, you're more likely to go to the polls in the first place. And I think this would tend to increase voter turnout. Voter turnout, even in a presidential election, has hovered around 50% of the voting age population, even in recent elections. The recent high in presidential participation, not so recent anymore, was 1960, with about 63% of the voting age population voting. I think if there were approval voting, then participation would go up by millions of voters, maybe roughly from 50% to 60%. So that would mean bringing tens of millions of new voters into the system because they can express themselves better. That's the primary reason people don't vote. It's the best we can determine. It's not the cost of voting, it's that they cannot express themselves well, so why vote if you don't think you can make much of a difference? Finally, approval voting is eminently practicable. It can be implemented in existing voting machines. We've checked the 50 state constitutions. There's nothing to prohibit voting for more than one candidate. We've also checked most of the constitutions around the world, and we find that there's no legal or constitutional restriction on casting more than one vote in most countries as well. Moreover, the system is very simple. You don't need, as with ranking systems, to have a complicated program to count votes, especially some systems which eliminate candidates progressively. I'll talk a little bit about that. So because it's not prohibited by any constitutions, to enact approval voting would take only a statute passed by a state legislature. Most election law is state-based. So it's a matter of actually getting a bill through the Senate and House in most states to enact approval voting. So I've talked about what I think are some of the advantages of approval voting. What are some of the disadvantages? Of course, there are none, but it's alleged that it might, for example, elect the lowest common denominator, the bland, inoffensive candidate who tries to be everything to everybody. But I would argue that if you're trying to be everything to everybody, then you're probably not going to be minimally acceptable to voters. And a good example of that would be Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a relatively right-wing candidate, but polls show that he would have won under any system, including approval voting. So I think that illustrates that you don't need to try to broaden your appeal to be Tweedledee and Tweedledum. You can have strong convictions like Ronald Reagan and still win. The second charge made against approval voting, it would is that it would undermine the two-party system. Well, in my view, there's nothing sacrosanct about the two-party system. Most democracies in the world have multi-party systems using different voting systems, which Jack will talk about. Moreover, I think if the two parties are so derelict as to sponsor relatively extreme candidates, there should be room in the middle for a candidate to run and win. And as I said, centrist candidates tend to be helped by approval voting. Finally, let me refer to some technical features. I wrote this book, as Eric said, with Peter Fishburne, called Approval Voting, if any of you are interested in more details. And there's a newer book that I did. This came out in 1983, but this is a revised edition. Mathematics and Democracy talks about voting and fair division systems. That came out in 2008. So some of the technical features are discussed in these books. It's more sincere and strategy-proof than other non-rank systems like plurality or plurality with a runoff. That means it's much more difficult to manipulate. There's a lot of strategic voting that you can do with plurality, much less so with approval. I've already said it better allows voters to express themselves and also express their intensities. They draw the line between acceptable and not, and that's probably the biggest gap between those you consider okay and those you don't. It compares favorably with rank systems, like the border count, whereby you use points. So you give the most points to your favorite, next most points to your next favorite, down to 0 points to your least favorite. That's a highly manipulable system. I won't say why, unless it's coming up in the discussion. The other prominent system that uses ranking is a Hare system of single transferable vote, sometimes called instant runoff. The main problem with that system is it's a ranking system that you can actually benefit by not ranking sincerely, by putting a first choice lower down, and he or she may win lower down rather than higher up. It's really perverse. Approval voting does a good job. A number of studies have showed in electing the so-called Condorcet winners. Finally, let me talk a little bit about the practical side of things. We tried to get approval voting used in a number of jurisdictions. There have been bills that have been sponsored in several states. I've testified in New Hampshire, New York, and other states about bills that have been introduced in state legislatures, but none has actually been enacted. But we have been more successful in getting approval voting implemented in private associations. The two major math societies, each with over 30,000 members, the Mathematical Association of America and the American Mathematical Society, now use approval voting to elect a president and other officers, as does the Institute of Operations Research and Management Science, the Game Theory Society, several computer societies, and it's very commonly used in colleges and universities to elect. My department elects a chair using approval voting. So we've had some use of approval voting, and it does pretty much what it purports to do. It tends to elect consensus candidates. I can tell you more about some examples of this. But we've been less successful in convincing legislators to enact it in public elections. I think if one jurisdiction, major jurisdiction, does so, like New York City or some state, then it's likely to be widely copied. But we have not gotten that first adoption. So I think that remains a challenge to people who believe in this kind of system.
And we'll talk more about that in the conversation.
Okay, and my final point is we even have a slogan for approval voting. You've all grown up with the idea of one person, one vote. And the fundamental idea behind this is that everybody's equal. Rich or poor, educated or uneducated, everybody has one vote. Our alternative slogan is one candidate, one vote. You make a judgment about each and every candidate. Is he or she acceptable? If so, you approve of them. That seems to me a much more fundamental principle than artificially restricting a person to one vote. Why shouldn't people be able to make judgments about each and every candidate? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Brahms, thank you so much. So we have a systemic problem, a systematic solution. We're going to zoom out a little more in our third and final talk before we go into a little bit of conversation and a Q&A to tie it all together. We are greatly honored to have Dr. Jack Nagel here. He is a professor emeritus of political science at the University of Pennsylvania. He studies democratic theory, voting systems, politics across the board in the United States, New Zealand, and Britain. He's a prolific author, as I think I mentioned. He's published articles all across the world in peer-reviewed journals, including some of the largest publications like American Political Science Review, Journal of Politics, World Politics, the list goes on and on. He serves on a couple of major editorial boards, the British Journal of Political Science and Political Science. And this year, I believe, according to his bio, he will be the president of the Penn Association of Senior and Emeritus Faculty. Is that right? So he has an administrative background as well at his university. Dr. Nagel is going to zoom out a bit for us and talk about restructuring our legislatures as a alternate systematic solution to the problem of not feeling represented. So, Dr. Nagel, pleased to have you.
Thank you, Eric. I had prepared a slideshow, but none of us had the technical access to break into the John Jay system. But if anyone wants to have this, give me your email address and I can send it to you, and that means you don't have to take notes right now. Also, if you have any questions as I go along where you want something clarified on the spot, don't hesitate to raise your hand. Bigger questions we can leave for the discussion. So as Eric and Aaron have mentioned, I'm going to talk about legislative elections. Most of the examples that Aaron and Steve gave were of executive elections. The U.S. is unusual in how frequently we directly elect executives such as president, governor, and mayor. We also have legislative elections, of course, for Congress, state legislature, city councils. And in those elections, we have a dominant method which has three components. There's a districting component where we use single-member districts. We carve up our jurisdictions so that each area is represented by one and only one legislature. The second component is a balloting method, and the balloting method is the one that's been discussed, where you vote for only one candidate instead of approval where you could do more, or a preferential ballot where you could rank order. And then finally, there is a decision rule, and the decision rule is a simple plurality rule. Whoever gets the most votes wins, even if that candidate has fewer than a majority. Now, most of us don't even think of giving this a name. It's just the natural way to conduct elections for Americans. But political scientists often call it single-member plurality, or SMP. In the British countries, it's often called first past the post on a horse racing analogy, or FPP. To give you a bit of an overview of the ecology of single-member plurality, where it exists, it is the simplest possible system for electing legislatures. Because it's so simple, it's the method that tended to be adopted early on when democracy started. So it's dominant in the countries where elections have been going on the longest time, such as the US and Britain. And in the countries that they, mostly Britain, influenced through imperialism, colonial rule, such as India, Canada, and Caribbean countries. So those all tend to use single-member plurality. But there are quite a number of countries where Britain influenced that have renounced single-member plurality and moved on to other systems, including Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, and South Africa. The trend is away from single-member plurality across the world. Why is that so? Well, SMP has a lot of representational failures, some of which have been alluded to already. It's a winner-take-all system, so it means that the votes in any district cast for losers have no effect. The losing voters are unrepresented, at least in the district. It promotes two-party dominance because the small parties tend to have no representation, their votes are wasted, people strategically move away from them, and those parties tend to wither. In the US, that two-party dominance is reinforced even further because we have a winner-take-all system for electing the president, which is so important. Single-member plurality usually performs poorly in representing women and minorities. Unless the minority group is geographically concentrated in certain districts, it's likely not to elect candidates. And women tend to fare less well in the extremely adversarial all-out struggle in a winner-take-all system in districts. And the drawing of district lines is crucial, so there's a huge incentive for gerrymandering, manipulating those lines to benefit one party or group. That gerrymandering goes farther in the US than anywhere else because in nearly all our states we allow the politicians to draw the districts. That's not necessary to do. Less primitive democracies have all moved beyond that and have nonpartisan neutral representation or districting boundary commissions to draw the lines, but we still let the politicians choose their voters. There are some other failures of SMP besides the representational failures. It fails from the fundamental point of view of majority rule. Very frequently, the party that dominates in a legislature under single-member plurality elections does not have the support of a majority of voters for some of the reasons Steve and Aaron have mentioned. It will only have the support of a plurality. So the majority indeed might be very unhappy with that ruling party, but their votes have been split or divided among several parties or spoilers. Then in this particular setting of the left forum, a very important bias of SMP systems is that they are biased against the parties of the left in many places. The reason for that is that in most countries, including many areas of the US, the party of the left tends to be dominant in densely populated and urban areas. So even if you do not have deliberate gerrymandering, natural drawing of district lines so that they're compact, contiguous, follow political boundaries and so forth, will result in overwhelming majorities for the left or left-center party in a place like New York City or Philadelphia, where the Democrats typically will rack up 80–90% majorities. Parties of the right generally have more diverse constituencies, suburban or rural areas in which there are some smaller cities. So they're going to win 60–65% majorities in many of those areas. The result is that if you add up the votes across the whole system, the party of the left will get more votes, but fewer seats for those votes. Their votes are allocated less efficiently. That's true right now for the U.S. House of Representatives, where the Democrats got 1 million more votes across the U.S. last time than the Republicans, and yet the Republicans have the majority of the House. It's true in many state legislatures, particularly in our largest and most urbanized states. If you wonder why the Republicans control the legislature in Pennsylvania or Ohio or Wisconsin, and yet the Democrats win the presidential elections, it has a lot to do with the districting, not only deliberate gerrymandering, which has been carried to a high art in Pennsylvania, my own state, but also this natural gerrymandering that results from the packing of districts. So that is an inherent problem of single-member plurality. Now, what is the solution? The solution that's been adopted in many countries around the world is proportional representation. The concept of proportional representation is very simple in concept, that it aims at an ideal in which each party will receive seats proportional to the number of votes it gets. So a party that wins a plurality, say 45% of the vote, will not get a majority of seats, but will get 45% of the seats. And a smaller party, say a Green Party, that only gets 10% of the vote will not be shut out entirely, but it will get 10% of the seats.
If someone runs as an independent and gets, let's say, 15% of the vote, how many seats would he get?
Proportional representation in most versions requires parties, so an independent would have a problem. But there are two versions where an independent could be elected, and I'll describe them shortly. Now, all actual PR systems, PR being the usual abbreviation for proportional representation, only approximate that ideal, sometimes only crudely so. So I would warn you to beware the bait and switch that people may argue for a PR system, but then either out of political necessity or whatever, have to water it down so much that it doesn't really deliver a lot of what PR should deliver in its best forms. The key factor in determining whether a PR system really works well or not is what political scientists call district magnitude, and that is how many members are elected from a district. PR systems require multi-member districts, so you have to move away from the American system of single-member districts, and you have to have multiple members elected. The extreme version of this would be when you have a nationwide, the whole nation is one district. Say Israel or the Netherlands operates that way, both I believe with 120 members of their legislature, you can achieve a high degree of proportionality. Even very small parties can be elected when you're dividing up the seats among 120. But in many countries, there's a desire to have regional representation, so to guarantee that members are chosen from particular areas. So you might have districts with 3 or 4 or 5 members. Then a very small party is unlikely to win seats. Say you get 10% of the vote in a 3-member district, you're not going to get a seat unless there are a great many parties running that really fragment the vote.
Excuse me, would you repeat what you said about the Israel now is one district? I didn't understand.
Instead of, I'm not sure if I caught your question.
Yeah, what they do in Israel different from us?
Oh, okay. They elect members of Knesset across the entire country of Israel.
Right.
So there's one district, which is all of Israel, has 120 members, and the seats are divided proportionally, more or less, to the votes across the whole country. Obviously, in a very large country, geographically large country, you probably would want to have regions rather than do that. But in smaller countries,
There's also minimum thresholds sometimes.
yeah, I was going to mention that besides district magnitude, another factor that affects how fine the proportionality is whether there's an explicit threshold. So in Germany or New Zealand, there's a 5% threshold. So a party that only got 4% of the votes will be shut out. It's to prevent too much fracturing of the party system. But a party that gets 6% will get 6% of the seats. There are some other factors that affect the fineness of proportionality, such as the particular formula or decision rule that's used.
Sorry, where there is 5% loss, like several parties may have below that,
Right.
is the division then made on 100 minus whatever?
Yeah, actually, I misspoke there. If you have a lot of votes wasted for sub-threshold parties, then a party that had 6% of the vote would actually get more than 6% of the seats, because those, you divide it among the parties that reach the threshold. Now, PR is not just one system, it's a set of families of electoral systems, and I'll give you a quick primer on them. Just for reference, party list PR, mixed member proportional PR known as MMP, and then the single transferable vote known as STV. And I'll just give you a quick overview. The most common form of PR, and the classic form, is party list PR. It's dominant in Europe and Latin America. And in party list systems, the party puts up a list of candidates, typically rank ordered from the number 1 candidate, who would be the candidate for prime minister on down. And the voters just vote for a party. You choose one party, and the proportion of votes that a party receives determines how far down its list candidates are elected. So if you have a list of 100 candidates, you get 40% of the vote. You get to choose your candidates 1 through 40, get into the legislature. Now there is a variant on this, that's what's called a closed list system, where the party determines the ranking entirely. Some countries have open list systems where individual voters can single out certain candidates and say, we want to move them higher on the list. There are arguments for both of those systems. In the most pure party list systems, as I mentioned, Israel or in the Netherlands, the whole country might be a district. That achieves higher proportionality. If you have regional lists, then the proportionality would be less unless you add additional tiers in order to compensate, so that you establish a nationwide finer proportionality. That's typically the case in Scandinavia, for instance, where they have regions, but they also have higher level adjustment tiers to achieve finer proportionality. Now, the second system, mixed member proportional, is the system used in Germany, New Zealand, Venezuela, and a few other places. It has 2 tiers, but the first tier is a single member district system, where the elections might be conducted just as we conduct them now. You vote for one, or you could use approval voting with it. But there is a second tier, which is a party list, and you typically cast 2 votes, one for a district representative and the other for a party list. The party's overall delegations in the legislature are determined by the list vote. which is adjusted for the districts they win at the single-member district level, so that there's overall proportionality. In this system, an independent could win in a district, and then you would cast a separate vote for a party to determine the party delegations. This system, many people think of as the best of both worlds because there is an attraction to having people who represent particular geographic areas, but it establishes the overall virtues of proportional representation. As a result, it has great appeal in countries that have a single-member district tradition, such as the Anglo-American countries. Although it was pioneered in Germany, it was adopted in New Zealand in 1993, and subsequently for the new assemblies in Scotland, Wales, and London. There's been serious consideration in Canadian provinces, but no adoption so far. The final system is the rarest. STV is used in Ireland for the Australian Senate and also in the little island country of Malta. It's a fairly complicated system, but instead of voting for parties, you vote for individuals. So there could be an independent that you vote for. It has multi-member districts. You rank order the candidates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Candidates are elected by achieving a quota of votes, and then votes are transferred. So if there, I said this is complicated, and I'll do a lot of hand-waving about it. If a candidate achieves much more than the quota, say the quota is 25% and you've got 35% of the votes, the goal of the system is not to waste any votes, so the surplus votes that you receive will be transferred to your voters' second or possibly third choices. Conversely, candidates who are eliminated early because they get so few votes, maybe only 5 or 10%, their votes are also transferred to the voters' second or third choice. The ideal is to have everybody's vote count at some point, maybe not for first preference, but later on. It is also an individualistic system. It doesn't have to have parties to work. It does, though, to work require rather small magnitude districts, say from 3 to 5. Otherwise, the cognitive task of rank ordering all those candidates gets too much for voters, and they're likely to follow the cues of parties, and it becomes like a partyless system. Okay, a couple minutes. I'll try to wrap up real quickly then. How about in the U.S.? Are these possible? Well, no, let me stick to the agenda first and give you the virtues of proportional representation in relatively pure form, where there's a pretty high degree of proportionality. First of all, you get fairness to parties, whether they're big or small, they'll get representation roughly proportional to their vote. That typically results in the representation of smaller parties in legislatures, and you get multi-party legislatures. So you have a wider range of opinion represented, left, right, center, Greens, so forth. To pass any legislation, you will need a coalition, whether it's a permanent coalition government or an ad hoc coalition around a particular bill. It means there has to be cooperation across party lines for the system to work. In many cases, this works out to less adversarial process, politics, more tradition of cooperation. People recognize the need for it. Typically, PR systems have better representation for women and minority groups, and they result in majority rule. That is, that the median legislature, where the majority tipping point is in the legislature, will roughly correspond to the median voter. You will not get that skewing to the right that exists in single-member district systems. Now, are there any possibilities for this in the U.S.? It's not possible for executive elections. You would look to another reform like approval voting or other options. It's not possible for the U.S. Senate. It's not possible for the U.S. House in small states that only have 1 or 2 members. Therefore, the effects of PR on the party system in the U.S. would be limited. They would have a less dramatic effect than in other countries that have PR. Nevertheless, it could be used. It could be used for the House, provided a 1967 statute that mandates single-member districts were repealed. It's not a constitutional requirement. Congress could repeal it. That would then make a single transferable vote a sensible option for smallish states with 3 to 5 members. For somewhat larger states, you could have STV with 2 or 3 districts, or you might have a version of mixed member proportional. And for the large states and the mega states, MMP would make sense in a country with a single member district tradition. In state legislatures, they're well suited either to list PR or more likely mixed member proportional, given our tradition. There is a dilemma of expansion of legislatures, which I can talk about later, but there is a possible solution to that as well. And finally, for local councils, many of our local councils are nonpartisan, so the only PR system that would work for them is STB, and in fact, some cities have STB already. Cambridge, Massachusetts has had it for a long time, and it's been adopted in a number of cities in California and Minnesota as well. There are some cities where other forms of PR might be feasible, larger cities such as Philadelphia. Now, the question is, how can we get there from here? And that is a topic for discussion or for another day. I have given a recent talk on that subject, and if anybody would like to see that, I'd be happy to send the paper to you, again, if you give me your email.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Jack Nagel. Do you want to come up? So I'm going to just start us off with one question, and then I'm hoping that you all have some questions, and we're just going to kind of go here. The discussion can go within the four of us, the three of them, out here. We'll do this for about 10, 15 minutes. If we run out of stuff after 5, we'll do it for 5. If you want to stick around for a few minutes after, we'll try to get out of here a little bit early. And we'll have a little time to stick around and we can chat one-on-one if you want to come up to any of us. So my question, I just want to kind of tie this together, and thank you, Aaron and Steve and Jack, for helping us make sense of some of the possible solutions to this disaster that Aaron has laid out for us. Yeah, we got sighs of sympathy here. If I wake up tomorrow morning, okay, I'm a busy guy, you're all busy, we all want a more just, democratic world or country or city or whatever, state. I wake up tomorrow morning, I have limited time and energy, but I want to feel represented. I don't feel represented. Should I get on board with approval voting? And is that the best bang for my buck in terms of as an activist? Or, as Jack said, it might be tricky, but should I spend my time and energy pushing for some sort of proportional representation, maybe in New York City? I mean, what do could you guys maybe touch on that? What's my best approach as an activist tomorrow morning?
I would say the method that's closest to what we currently have has to be approval voting. We're used to doing things within the single member framework. Not that there's anything wrong with using proportional methods. It has a ton of advantages, but what we're used to right now is working within the single member framework and using a choose one method. All you have to do to switch to approval voting, you can use a plurality ballot, but just change the directions. Instead of saying choose one candidate, just say choose one or more. That's literally all you're doing. So as far as transitioning to a better method, this one has the least amount of distance that you have to travel.
Steve, do you agree?
Yes, and I'd say one argument you can use is we use approval voting all the time in our personal decisions. When you go out with people and want to choose a movie, want to choose a restaurant, what's acceptable to the most people? You might like or find acceptable 2 or more restaurants and 2 or more movies. Why shouldn't we be able to express that? So I think that's a good argument to make in claiming that we can make this work at the electoral level.
And Jack, how do you feel if I wake up tomorrow? What's your advice for me?
Well, approval voting or any other reform of single winner elections won't solve the districting problem. By itself, it doesn't reduce the incentive to gerrymandering, and it doesn't reduce the natural gerrymandering that skews the results of district elections. So if you're looking at an executive election that is inherently single winner, then approval voting is a reform to consider. The so-called instant runoff voting is also being pushed in many areas, and there's an esoteric debate about those. I've been on both sides of that debate. I've been involved with Steve in experiments on approval voting, and I supported some of the efforts of Fair Vote, the reform organization, on instant runoff. I would like to see more experiments, adoptions of approval voting. I'd like to see more adoptions of instant runoff voting. We'll see which will work. Now, the change of legislatures, which would be toward PR, is a bigger change to do, and therefore probably a harder change to do. It happens less frequently, but it can happen. That's why I've spent so much time studying New Zealand. To many of us, that seemed a miracle, because we have a view that there's an iron law of legislative electoral change. That is, why would the people who are elected under the current system ever want to change it? And the answer is they usually don't, and therefore systems don't change. But once in a while, events come together in a certain way, and it's not easy. The paper I mentioned lists 11 ingredients that were necessary to the triumph of reform in New Zealand. So it's not easy to get, but it can happen. And of course, people on the left know radical changes are not easy.
I think we can all agree on that. So I want to open it up to questions right here, Sir Joseph.
Sure, thank you very much. The question that I have is somewhat cynical in terms of America. We're a simple folk. We can't even balance our own checkbooks very easily. And the system that we have, as flawed as it is one that is understandable. I mean, that's certainly an argument.
Pick one. Can't be simpler than that, right?
I'm sorry.
Pick one.
Pick one. That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
You go to you go out to eat and you look at the menu. The longer it takes you, more choice, the longer it takes you to pick.
Maybe we call it amoeba voting.
Yeah, amoeba voting could be.
Yeah.
So my question, my question is reflective of the complexity of the voting system in terms of the value. How does one, understanding that might get a better choice and not the extremes, because I'm not a big fan of the extremes in either party that come out with I love the example of David Duke, and I remember back then the poster said, vote for the crook or the racist. Those are your choices in Louisiana, and sometimes in places in New York and New Jersey, not much. So my question is, in what manner do we persuade those who are in power to choose a system that seems very much more complex than that?
I think that's a great question, and just to paraphrase, so how can us simple folk, us simple Americans, how can we understand these complicated reforms? Anyone want to take that?
I don't think approval voting is complicated. I think it's actually easier for some people to say that 2 or 3 are acceptable rather than choose one, perhaps arbitrarily. And I gave you the analogy to choosing a restaurant, choosing a movie. I think that's understandable to people. And I gave you a slogan: one candidate, one vote.
Would you argue, Steve, that it's intuitive? You sort of know what you approve of? Do you think it requires a lot of cognitive effort to decide?
No, I think it's actually easier than making an arbitrary choice of one.
So Dr. Stephen Brown argues approval voting is simpler for the amoebas in the United States.
My counter to that, because I knew you were going to say that, because it is your book and your proposal, is that the idea that I go into the voting booth and I vote for, let's say, Ralph Nader, Al Gore, and some other candidate all equally, when I don't really feel that they are all equal.
That's a good point. So I think you have to draw the line between acceptable and not. So maybe Ralph Nader and somebody also on the left is acceptable, but Al Gore is too much in the middle. You have to draw the line. So I'm giving you that responsibility, and I think you should accept that responsibility. Now you can express yourself better. You are drawing the line. You're saying there's too big a gap here. Only these are acceptable and these are not. Thereby you express intensities. You're saying this is a big gap, and I can only live with only those two and not others. I think we have to give voters responsibility in making those choices. And that's my problem with some of the ranking systems, like the border count. You give an arbitrary number of points. There are 3 candidates, 2 to your favorite, 1 to your middle candidate, and 0 to your third candidate. I don't think this should be dictated, and approval voting doesn't dictate that.
Anyone want
Simplicity is a virtue, but it's about the only virtue of the existing system. in looking at reforms, we don't want to make things too complicated, although outside of politics, we in the U.S. tend to make things terribly complicated. I was just helping my daughter sign up under the Affordable Care Act, and that's an example of going way too far.
If Jack Nagel can't figure it out, we're screwed.
But in looking at an electoral system, you have to distinguish what the voter is asked to do on the ballot from the mechanics behind the scenes, the counting rules. So, for example, party list PR is a very simple ballot. You vote for a party. It's a bit easier usually for most of us to vote for a party than to distinguish individuals, in fact, because parties have more enduring meaning. The counting rule, the formula by which the sausage is turned into seats, is esoteric, but the voters don't need to worry too much about that. They can understand the concept of proportionality and how it actually works out in the algorithm. Leave that for the counting. One of my concerns about STV is that it does have extreme complications or complicated decisions that have to be made in deciding how to do the transfers, and that could be a problem with it. Nevertheless, in some situations, it may be a better system, the best one we could use.
So I think we all agree, yeah, and just one second. I think we all agree that simplicity is a major consideration, and it's a great question. Thank you, Joe. So question back there?
I would think in New York City, I mean, I think we're due for another charter revision. We haven't had one since 1989. Like, look at the borough of Queens, which I think is the most diverse borough in the country. I think there's about 12 or 13 city council members in Queens, and the districts are carved up. And I think, wow, if you could have just borough-wide elected city council members voted with proportional representation, that would be such a great demonstration project.
But New York City has had a past history of using STV, and I'm not up on the details of it. Certainly for a 12 or 13 member council, I would not want to use STV because it's too complicated a job. If you carved up the borough into several 3, 4, 5 member districts, maybe so. But that also could be suitable for an MMP style election. In fact, in Philadelphia, we have a 16 member council. 10 members are already elected from single member districts, and 6 are elected at large using another form of voting called the limited vote. So it would be very easy in Philadelphia to adopt MMP, keeping the 10 councilman districts and having the 6 allocated on a compensatory way to achieve proportionality across the parties.
Because in Queens, I think you've got like a very sizable number of like South Asians now. Queens, and if there was a system where they would be virtually guaranteed to have at least one or two members elected to the city council.
Well, there actually is a system we haven't talked about called cumulative voting, whereby you're given a fixed stock of votes. Say if there are 5 council members, you're given 5 votes, and you can concentrate them any way you want. You can put all 5 on one person, and if people with similar mindcasts do that, you can assure that election if you have that proportion in the society. That's actually used in a number of small cities now in the United States. And it works if the minority is relatively scattered, and therefore you can't carve a district for the minority. So I think that's an alternative for that kind of situation.
And the goal there, that you want a legislature that sort of looks and feels more like the voting body as a whole,
Right.
I think is something all the panelists that I could say believe in. Is that fair?
The STV can also work in a similar fashion to cumulative voting. The minority can concentrate their preferences and, elect one member without having any racial quota, but just by their strategy of voting. But any party list system, whether it's MMP or party list, the parties, if they have any sense, in their lists, will have a balanced ticket. So if there's a sizable minority ethnic group, they will make sure to have some people on electable positions. In New Zealand, before MMP, the Maori minority, who are about 15% of the population, were terribly underrepresented, just as African Americans are here. And after MMP, their representation almost immediately went up to around 15% and have stayed there, mainly because of the parties were putting Maori on their list. Although there were some other factors.
Sir, did you have a question?
Yeah, a couple. I just wondered if you had, is there a kind of an analysis of optimal size for districting? Just thinking, and also I wanted to say about time-spaced elections, where there's progressive. for me, like a crucial issue is the availability of information and the time that people have as, being underpinning of democracy. It doesn't help when, there's elections which people do not have enough time to process or to see the candidates up close and so on. And I just wondered if you felt like, in terms of having different rounds, such as in France, or having smaller as opposed to larger districts, if you're going to have them in terms of, cognitive impact, is an issue.
So what could we do to help voters have more time?
Well, to mix this choice issue
Yeah.
with the information
Yeah.
and consciousness.
Know who they're voting for.
Yeah, yeah.
Any thoughts on that? Aaron?
There's a couple of scholars. There's Douglas Amy and David Farrell. They recommend district sizes of about at least 5 when they're doing multi-winner systems using a proportional method. When you have a larger amount of people elected at once and you're using a proportional method, you're able to lower the threshold so minorities are going to be able to get a better shot at representation. It also makes it that much harder to gerrymander the district itself. It's difficult to try to fix the election for yourself when you're using a proportional method, when you have a healthy district size. As far as information, that's of the voters, is that what you're asking?
Of the how do voters understand the candidates and time?
So they could know the candidates.
Yeah.
I think...
Or their philosophy or whatever.
I think that's more of a question of having independent organizations like League of Women Voters getting that information out and making that available. It may be a little bit more of a separate issue than the voting method itself.
Steve, I'm curious, though, you had mentioned that you strongly believe that approval voting would significantly increase turnout and engagement. Do you think that would also increase our level of discourse and our the depth of our research into candidates as well?
Well, I don't think people do research on candidates.
Maybe research?
There's more than enough information on the internet, which most people have access to. I think, if anything, the presidential election process is too elongated, with primaries going over several months. Now, to be sure, things are decided usually within the first 6 weeks in most cases, but not all. Consider the Clinton-Obama race that went to June from the early primaries in January. So I think people are, there's a surfeit of information, too much, so that people become bored and cynical. So I think it's a double-edged sword.
So tighten it, but focus it. That's what I'm hearing. Question right there, ma'am, and maybe we'll do
Well, what about the progressive election aspect, such as in France? How do you feel about that?
Well, a number of states do have runoffs, like France. And that's particularly true in one-party states in the South, in the past, for example, where 2 Democrats often compete in the primaries, and that decides the election because the Republican Party. Now it's more dominant, but it used not to be. I think runoffs are a poor solution by and large, because as we saw in the case of Louisiana, they may pit the left against the right and you lose the middle in between. So I think approval voting does a better job of finding that candidate in the middle.
Thank you.
Yes, none of you mentioned getting rid of the electric system.
Yeah.
And I think it was by 4 votes that Bush won over Gore. And it's outmoded. Why are we still dealing with
Why
that?
are we using the Electoral College? And okay, that kind of comes back to my first question. I wake up tomorrow morning. Is that my number 1 priority? Like, maybe forget about approval and proportional representation. Let's get rid of the Electoral College. That sounds really important. Yes?
That is something Steve and I think very much agree on. And this is the one electoral reform that is most likely to succeed in the reasonably near future. There is a movement called the National Popular Vote, an extremely ingenious plan that would basically circumvent the current electoral college. It depends on passage in state legislatures. It was recently passed in New York State.
In New York now.
And
We're 61% there of the 270 electoral votes needed.
in brief, do you want to go into this one?
Why?
I think
Real
that's-
30 seconds.
Yeah.
And we can talk more about it after. I want to get 1 or 2 more questions.
The Constitution, as you probably know, gives each state legislature the power to decide how its electoral votes will be cast. So this plan would have states pass identical bills in which they commit to deliver their own electoral votes to whoever wins the vote nationally, not within the state, but nationally. And the plan takes the form of an interstate compact, a legally binding agreement among states, so that it will only go into effect when enough states have passed it that together, the states that have committed to this plan control a majority of the Electoral College. So it doesn't abolish the Electoral College, but once they reach the 270, it basically negates the Electoral College as we know it and substitutes the national popular vote winner. This has been gradually working its way through a lot of states, and it's now got 61% of what it needs. Both California and New York have passed it, New Jersey, Maryland, a number of other states.
So if that speaks to us, that's called the National Popular Vote
Plan.
National Popular Vote Plan.
NPV.
Okay, awesome.
On that, I mean, the Electoral College, it doesn't make any sense anymore. It's obvious to, I think, most people that it's a terrible way to go. It doesn't make any sense. But one thing to recognize with that is, say you get this National Popular Vote Plan to go through, it would be an improvement over what we have now with the Electoral College. But the issue is, at the end of the day, you're still using plurality voting.
Yeah.
You're still using that same choose one method. Independent third parties are still not going to get an accurate reflection of support when they run. And you still have a squeeze in the middle. So you still are not going to get your moderate candidate, and you still have issues with vote splitting and spoilers. So even if you get the National Popular Vote Plan, it's not going to solve any of those issues.
Great. So we're going to do one more question, so you have to promise me, whoever I call on, that it's a really good one, and then we'll have about 10 minutes to hang out and we can actually talk in depth up here. So if you're willing to save your question for that, that'd be awesome. I think this man right here was the first one in, and he's going to be the last one out. So Akash was there?
Thanks, Akash.
Go ahead.
So these all sound like good ideas and certainly better than the existing system. What is the biggest criticism or the resistance at federal, national level to these changes?
Let me just paraphrase. You're asking, what are the largest criticisms, or what are the largest barriers to getting these accomplished? That's what you mean. So okay, that's a great way to end. Thank you, because I was going to say, what can we do? So it's sort of the same question. What's stopping us from having, let's start with approval, and maybe we'll end on proportional representation. Why don't we have approval voting anywhere in the United States? Aaron, you study this.
Well, I think the big thing with, and this is something true with trying anything new, you're used to doing the same thing, and really we don't even think about this. I mean, when people mention the voting method, they think choose one. Most people don't even appreciate that there are different ways to go about doing this. Mm-hmm. And so we have this sort of status quo bias, where it's difficult for us to shift to something different, even if that is monstrously better. So when we're stuck in this situation, I think we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, what if right now, the way that we did elections, when we're doing executive offices, you're able to choose as many candidates as you want, and then those votes wins. Like, that's the way it is right now. We'll say we're in this pretend world where that's the way it is right now. Would you go out of your way to make a reform to limit your vote so that you can only choose one? So that's really the way that we have to frame this, to get out of the status quo bias of making this hard leap to switching to something else. So what if it was the opposite? Would you go and make a concerted effort to limit yourself in the way that you're able to give an expression and avoid and go back to having all these terrible vote splitting issues?
So from Aaron, I'm hearing ignorance and inertia. That's what I'm hearing there. Steve, what do you think?
Well, speaking very practically, I think the key is to find a person in the state legislature, because most election law comes out of state legislatures, sometimes city councils, who is willing to get behind this. And I've tried to do that in the states in which I've been an activist. Because you, as an outsider, cannot exert the same kind of influence that somebody inside can do. But you, as an outsider, can also do your part. So I've written op-ed pieces, I've been interviewed on television, radio. So I've tried to do publicity. But I think the key is to convince a legislator or a set of legislatures that there's a big problem, and that they're not going to be heard, at least if they're moderates, and to get behind this. And usually what helps is there's a crisis. We have an election like that in Louisiana. I remember when, at the end of the 2000 election, I got a call from out of the blue by a Nobel laureate in chemistry at Harvard saying, we've got to do something about this. And I heard about approval voting. What can we do? This is a great teaching moment. Well, the teaching moment passed, I'm afraid. We said in our book, this will be the election reform of the 20th century. Well, we're in the 21st century. It hasn't happened. You just have to keep plugging.
So, Dr. Brams, I think that makes a lot of sense. And Dr. Nagel, what's stopping proportional representation? Why don't we have it?
Well, for changing the way a whole legislature is elected, you have a whole legislature full of opponents. So that's the problem. There are two ways of getting around that. One is if there is availability of a referendum initiative, which there is in some states and not in others. So electoral reform has a better path there. In New Zealand, MMP was adopted by a referendum, although the legislature had to put the question to the people. The other element is if one of the major parties feels it's disadvantaged. The two major parties both generally oppose PR because they have a duopoly, so why would they want other parties to be able to enter? But if in a duopolistic competition, it doesn't mean that it's fair between the two parties. And as I've suggested, the current system in many states and nationally is currently unfair to the Democrats. So whether they appreciate that and having control at some juncture decide to launch a reform process, that's basically what happened in New Zealand. And the process ran away from the Labour Party and became much more radical than they want. I don't know if the Democrats would launch a process or if they lose control of it, but one could always hope.
Right. So I think what I'm hearing from both Dr. Brams and Dr. Nagel is if you can find someone or some people within the system, the existing system, who you can get on board, get inside, and work your way out and expand outwards.
On that point, I mean, Dr. he mentioned ballot initiatives, referenda, and he also had mentioned before that New York City had used a proportional method. Well, that's how they got that in. They used referenda in order to use that, and they had done that in a number of other cities through the 20s and the 50s, and we have Cambridge, Massachusetts as a residual as a city that still uses proportional method. But that's how that was implemented. It was implemented by using referenda, and it was only after decades of resistance from major parties that used rhetoric to try to have the referenda overturned and send it to the polls again. But it took a long time to do that because there was a lot of resistance. But that's a way to get around elected officials' worry of, well, this is the election method that got me into office. I don't want to switch it because that might jeopardize my chances or my friends' chances in the future. So if you use a referenda, you get around that issue.
Actually, the reason it got defeated in New York was it elected a couple of communists in 1946, and that was not people's idea of good proportional representation.
Oh my God!
Oops, democracy worked. The people were represented. All right, well, so there is hope, and the 21st century offers us not only a clean slate, but there are already many campaigns in the work. I will give a quick shout out. Last thing I'll say, there is a referendum. There's a ballot measure in process right now in Oregon called the Oregon Unified Primary, right? You can read more about this. This would be a use of approval voting in an open primary in the state of Oregon. This has a lot of buzz. There's news stories about it. There's videos. Look it up. The Oregon Unified Primary. This would be the first official use of approval voting in the United States. So it's happening. There is energy here. So there is hope, and I hope that you will continue to be interested in these matters and these problems. So I want to thank so much our panel here, Aaron Hamlin, Steve Brams, and Jack Nagel, and thank you all for coming.